Hey there, thanks for joining in. Last time I made a frame bag, first try. Let's see if I can make something else. What's missing in this picture? You got it, fork bags. Check this out. A couple of simple fork bags. So let's toss them on the bike and let's see how to make them.
So one of the design elements of my fork bags is I wanted to have a daisy chain running down the side. This for two reasons. For the top one, I wanted to have a spot where I could clip on a carabiner. Primarily, I'm going to have food in these, so I'd like to hang them from a tree. On the bottom, I wanted to have something that I could hang a noisemaker from. Well, that's my dangle mug, so let's move that to the back, but let's get started with this. So I used a simple coffee bag as kind of my template, stand-up bottom. So I just looked to see how it was made by cutting off the edges, seeing how the bottom was attached on, and then just basically transferring that into my little prototype. So as you can see, there's the bottom, the seam that runs around the edge, the flat bottom insert. Moving on to my simple little sketch diagram here, I wanted my bags to be about 5 inches in diameter and about 16 to 18 inches tall. You have to remember that you're going to lose about 2 inches of fabric when you fold over and sew the top webbing buckles. Doing the math, my 5-inch diameter runs out to be about 45 centimeters in circumference. So here's one panel, and here's a second panel, and I have just enough material left over for my bottom bits. So we cut the fabric in our two panels. For safety, I'm labeling top on both of mine. So as you can see from my prototype, the seam runs down the bottom, and I'm going to be running my daisy chains down the side of the bag. So in essence, I'm going to have a left bag and a right bag. So left bag's going to have the daisy chain on the left side. So I wrote a little left on the inside where that daisy chain is going to be. And similarly for the right bag where the daisy chain is going to run on the side, I wrote right on the inside. So if we turn this inside out, we can use this as our template, knowing where our daisy chains are going to have to be put on. Those actually get put on first before the bag actually gets made. In doing this bag, run a test of where your pressure foot lines up with your fabric and how far in your seam actually goes. Mine is 1 centimeter exactly. When laying out my template, I need to find two things: the middle of my entire panel and the middle of each side. So you need to take into account that 1 centimeter, in my case, 1 centimeter seam along the side. So next is to draw the round portions on the bottom. So if you take something like a plate and you line up the center of your panel and the edge of where your seam is going to be, you can find a plate that's about the right size to get a nice gentle arc and use all the fabric on the bottom. So here I mark the center of my panel, and I take my plate and I line it up with the edge of my seam and the center of my panel, and then I draw my bottom portion. And then I repeat for the other side, aligning it on the center and aligning it with the edge of the seam, not the edge of the fabric, but where your seam is going to be. There we go. So I drew a little diagram of my daisy chains and where I wanted to put all of my seams so I could get all the measurements done correctly. You'll see at the end here where my loop is, I actually do double stitch and a cross pattern, so that reinforces it quite well. Next I took my webbing and I used clips to hold my loops in place where I was going to have them, making sure that I had enough overlap to do my stitches. And then I marked my webbing where I wanted all of my seams to be. There's a complete one. You can see another one up top. Next was to transfer this onto our fabric. So here is the daisy chain on the fabric. So take time and be careful to mark exactly where your daisy chain is going to be. And make sure you double check that you're doing it on the correct side of your panel. In this case, I'm doing my left bag. And now I'm going to do the same thing for my right bag. So here I'm stitching on my daisy chains. You can see where I've got my little Z stitch at the end there. Make sure you go and double back and forth on your stitches to lock them up nice and tight. With both bag daisy chains now sewed on, it's ready to roll up the bag and sew the main seam. When you do your main seam, it's very important that you don't go beyond the bottom where the arc stops. It has to end right there because that's where the material is actually going to be folded. Any farther and it's going to stitch them together. So I'm starting at the bottom, placing my needle exactly where I want to start. I go a little bit, I go backwards to lock my stitches, making sure I don't go back too far. And then I finish up and sew the entire side. Next, we're going to prepare our bottom panel. We just fold it in half, make sure that we have enough fabric, and cut out a chunk of our panel that we have. So folding this nice and flat, crease the folded edge really hard, and I cut up to exactly where our arc ends at the bottom, no farther. Then I take my bottom panel and I will slide it in. And that's how we're going to be sewing it. So you need to make sure that that panel is held firmly up in the very top where the cut ends on the one side and where your mark is on the other side. So in my case, I pinned my panel in place on one side. Once you get the first seam done, then nothing will move anyway, so the second seam is pretty easy. There, all pinned in place. Let's get ready to sew this arc. So again, it's very important that you start exactly where the arc starts and not beyond it. So when you're doing this, make sure you place your needle exactly where you want it to start. So here I'm putting the needle exactly at the beginning of the arc. Slowly start my stitches. And then go backwards to lock my stitch. And then forward and finish the arc. And the same thing at the other end. Make sure you don't go beyond the arc. And just make sure that you lock off your stitches by going reverse. And then you repeat on the other side. However, I want to show you that everyone makes mistakes. And after I sewed mine all up, I realized that my bottom panel piece was actually in the wrong way. So I've got to take this all apart and flip my fabric around. So here we go. This is the way I had my panel in the first time, and that's wrong. We want it to be our outside of our fabrics together. That's the way it should be. So let's do this again. And here I am sewing it again. And there we have it. The panel is actually put in the right way. So now we're going to cut off all the excess. Only cut one side at a time, as trying to cut 4 layers would just be too much. So cut it equivalent to kind of how the rest of your seams are, with about a 1 centimeter left over. And here I'll cut the other side. So now we can turn the bag inside out and take a look to see how the bottoms turned out. I think this is okay. Next we move on to dealing with the top. Now I used leftover fabric, so my tops are uneven. I've calculated the maximum amount of fabric that I have on my shortest bag. So I've made similar marks on each bag, and I'm just gonna cut the tops off. So I've made a mark to make sure that I get it nice and square. With this X-PAC, I actually find that using a paper shear, or this case a roller cutter for paper, is perfect for keeping square corners. The webbing that I used for the top, I used 3/4 inch webbing, but I used two different kinds. One is a bit stiffer and one is more flexible. The stiffer one is going to be used by itself, and the one that's not as stiff is going to be used for the buckle. Once the buckle gets looped in there, it'll be nice and flexible when you need to do the rolls and do up your buckles. So next I measured how much my stiffening webbing is going to be. Measured that. And whenever you cut any kind of webbing, just make sure you take a lighter to it really quick just to burn off all the little ends. So I took a look at an existing roll top stuff sack that I had, and I made a decision that I wanted my stiffener to be on the back side of my bag. So my stiffener is going to go on the back side. So once you've positioned where your stiffening webbing is going to be, when you sew it on, sew down the dead center of it. It's very important when you're doing this that you've got the other portion of the bag, because it is a cylinder, not underneath your webbing. It takes a little bit of practice, but as you can see, I'm pushing it away with my fingers, so I'm making sure that I only have one side of my bag and my stiffening webbing, sewing down the center of my webbing. You'll see why I'm sewing down the center in a minute. So now we've got the stiffening portion in, and we've sewn down the center of it. We're going to now take this and we're going to fold it over once, and we're going to fold all the way around the bag. Make sure it's nice and neat and tidy, and nice and tight too. So now we're going to sew as close as we can to the edge that I'm pointing at. Now since we have it folded over, we're going to sew as close to that edge as we can, and go all the way around the bag, even where there is no stiffener, all the way around the bag. So the same thing as we did before, make sure that you're only sewing through one side of the bag. Take your time, do your best to sew as close to the edge as possible, whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm not a great sewer, so I don't sew that close to the edge. And don't forget to lock the end of your stitches. So now we've done this to both of our bags. So we turn our bag right side out again, and as you can see, there's our seam going all the way around our bag. Now we're going to prepare our buckles. So our buckles are going to be overlapped, and they're going to be sewn on a particular way so that they're nice and strong. So if we take a look, I'll draw it out here for you. There's our buckle. Here's our webbing. And we're going to sew a bunch of stitches there and a bunch of stitches there, and we're going to have a cross pattern in between. That'll make it nice and strong. So when measuring the length for your buckles, in my case, my bag's 8.5 inches. So I'm going to take my buckles, I'm going to make them about 9.5 inches between the buckles. I have them pinned and all ready to go. This is where you take a close look at some buckle setups. The buckles actually have an arc in them. So make sure that your arc is going in the direction of how you want your bag closed, so they're not kind of backwards. So take the time and make sure they're done right. So there's my two buckles. Now I'm going to sew the ends together. Again, back and forth a fair bit, a couple of times. And then I'm just going to turn 45 degrees, and I'm going to sew in my X pattern. I have a pretty basic old sewing machine, so this isn't pretty, but it's pretty strong. And there you can see my X pattern. So do this on all four ends. And now you have one side that's got the stiffener, and you've got the other side that has nothing in it. That's going to be for your buckle side. So take the time, sew it in just like you did before. We're going to put a seam down one side, a seam down the other, and then redo your X pattern and your boxes at the end so that it's nice and firmly attached on the sides of the bags. And there you have it. It's all done. Thanks for joining in. Hope this was informative and maybe you can make some for yourself. I found them pretty easy. A little mistakes here and there, but I think they'll work just fine. Stuff something in it, roll it up, and you've got yourself a fork bag.
Hey, check this out. Pretty cool, eh? Try it again. Pretty neat, eh? Anyway, catch you later. Don't forget to like and click that subscribe button.